War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. War made the U.S. independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Understanding America's wars is essential for understanding American history. Welcome to Key Battles of American History, a podcast in which we discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. Here is your host, James Early.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Key Battles of American History. This is your host, James Early, as always, and I am super duper excited today to bring a very, very special episode to you. We're going to leave the topic of World War II for a while, and we're going to go back to the Civil War again, and we're going to look at a fascinating figure of the Civil War. It was the most remarkable political about-face in American history. During the Civil War, General James Longstreet fought tenaciously for the Confederacy. He was alongside Lee at Gettysburg and won a major Confederate victory at Chickamauga. But after the war, Longstreet dramatically changed course. He supported the post-war amendments and joined the newly elected integrated government in Louisiana. When white supremacists took up arms to oust that government, Longstreet, leading the interracial state militia, did battle against former Confederates. His defiance ignited a firestorm of controversy as white Southerners branded him a race traitor and blamed him retroactively for the South's defeat in the Civil War. Although he's one of the highest-ranking Confederate generals, Longstreet has never been commemorated with statues or other memorials in the South because of his post-war rejection of the lost cause mythology and advocacy for racial reconciliation. But he's being rediscovered in the age of racial reckoning. This is the first biography in decades and the first to give proper attention to Longstreet's long post-Civil War career. Well, the name of the book we're going to discuss today is Longstreet, the Confederate general who defied the South. And I'm joined by the author, Elizabeth R. Varon, or we're going to call her Liz. She is the Langborn M. Williams Professor of American History at the University of Virginia and a member of the Executive Council of UVA's John L. Now III Center for Civil War History. Varon's most recent book, Armies of Deliverance, A New History of the Civil War, won the 2020 Gilder Lehman Lincoln Prize and was named one of the Wall Street Journal's best books of 2019. And I will add a personal note. It is excellent. I read it myself a couple years ago. Really, really enjoyed that. Liz, welcome to the Key Battles of American History.
Well, thanks so much for having me, James. I really appreciate it.
I'm honored to have you on my humble podcast, and this is going to be a great conversation. I loved this book. I loved Armies of Deliverance. I haven't read your other ones. I need to. But Liz and I were talking earlier before I started recording, and we were talking about how we both started as Civil War buffs. And I told Liz that Longstreet, until a few months ago, Longstreet was the only really top Civil War general of whom I had not read a biography. And I was thinking, I need to read a biography of Longstreet one of these days. And then one day I got an email from her publisher saying, hey, here's a biography of Longstreet coming out by Elizabeth Varon. And I'm like, wow, I got to talk about that. And so I immediately hit reply and said, yes, I'm in. And Longstreet has always been one of my favorite figures in history. He's definitely one of my favorite Civil War generals. He is my favorite Confederate general. I don't know if are you still allowed to have a favorite Confederate general? I don't know. But I like Longstreet ever since I read the novel The Killer Angels back in college in the late 80s. Really, he's been a very fascinating figure to me. And so I'm looking forward to unpacking his life, his career, his thinking, and just the paradox that is James Longstreet. So you ready, Liz?
Oh, let's take it away. Absolutely, James.
Great. Okay. So let's start from the beginning. Liz, can you please give me a brief overview of Longstreet's pre-Civil War life and career? And then to follow up on that, do you see anything in his actions during that time that might foreshadow his future decision to break ranks with the majority of Southerners and become a radical Republican? Any early tremors or warning signs?
Yeah, that's a great question about whether anything in his early life prefigures this later dramatic about face, as I put it. And it's a great question in part because after he does become a Republican, and breaks ranks with ex-Confederates, some of them will retroactively cast doubt on his commitment to the Confederate cause during the war. And as they criticize his record as a military commander and blame him for the South's defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg and for the overall loss of the war, they'll suggest, sometimes indirectly, sometimes quite directly, that his heart hadn't been in it to begin with, and that helps to explain why he didn't perform the way they feel that he should have. So, this kind of stakes are high on this question in terms of Longstreet studies and interpretation. And the answer to your question is sort of no and yes about whether there's anything that foreshadows future decisions. So no, in the sense that Longstreet grew up in plantation society, a slaveholding family. His uncle was one of the leading, most sort of virulent, hot-headed, militant pro-slavery ideologues, making the case for secession in the entire South, a very influential man who held a certain kind of sway over Longstreet's own political development. Longstreet was an eager expansionist, supported the extension of slavery, and that was part of the agenda of the Mexican War, in which he fought as a career soldier and West Point graduate. He was an eager secessionist. We know that some major Confederate generals were people who had doubts about secession until it was a fait accompli. Longstreet sort of rushed into the Confederate ranks. He was not one of these reluctant Confederates. And then, throughout the war, if we look at his both actions and words, we see he was very much a true believer in the Confederate cause and in its racial politics, opposed to emancipation, doing everything he could to undermine it, trying to motivate his troops with sort of frothing speeches about the barbarism of the Yankees and their anti-slavery agenda and so on. So he is very much a kind of last-ditch, diehard Confederate. So no sort of intimations there of the turnabout that he'll later make. On the other hand, and this is an exercise in hindsight, but there's a wild card in all this, and that is his friendship with U.S. Grant. The two men were dear buddies before the war as West Pointers. Their wives and families were friends. Obviously, secession and war interrupted that friendship. So the friendship itself isn't much of a sort of determining factor. But crucially, Grant, as the commander who brings Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia to heel at Appomattox, Grant extends the hand of clemency, of magnanimity, forgiveness to Confederates in his very lenient Appomattox terms. And Longstreet sees that offer of magnanimity on Grant's part through the lens of the two men's friendship. And Longstreet really takes Grant's offer to heart. And Grant's offer essentially is, there won't be any punishment for you Confederates if you repent and atone of your sins and mistakes. Grant's magnanimity was intended to sort of change hearts and minds and affect the compliance and submission of Confederates. Most of them don't submit and don't comply, but Longstreet, in part because the two men had been such good friends and he had such immense respect for Grant as a military figure and as a man, Longstreet really takes those terms of Grant's to heart. So the Grant friendship is a key part of this story. And I guess what I'm saying here is that the friendship itself wouldn't have been decisive, but Grant's actions at Appomattox make it a key part of Longstreet's story going forward.
Yeah, interesting. That just goes to show that when you show kindness and compassion and mercy to people, you never know the effect it's going to have on them down the road, do you?
You never do. And I mean, Grant was deeply disappointed that most Confederates, the vast majority, didn't react the way that Longstreet did. But it's very telling that Longstreet, again, saw these surrender terms through this personal lens.
All right. Well, I have a couple of questions about the war itself, and we're not going to dig into the weeds with the battles. Many, many other people have done that. But I'm more interested in the mindset of Longstreet in the context of these battles. So Longstreet's exploits from Bull Run to Fredericksburg are well known, but his Suffolk campaign is much less well known. And on page 55, you mentioned this, and I'm going to quote you. You said, although militarily less consequential than his previous campaigning, the Suffolk campaign provides a revealing window into Longstreet's psyche, morale, and command calculations through his extensive correspondence with Lee and with the commanders of his own sub-departments. That was an intriguing quote. So can you please elaborate on that? Tell me more.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, it is important to note that in the fighting up until that point, you mentioned some of the key battles like Fredericksburg. Longstreet learns of valuable lessons, particularly his belief in the efficacy of defensive fighting and counterattacks, occupying the good ground on which to sort of invite the enemy to attack you on terms unfavorable to the enemy, permitting you to counterstrike in ways that are decisive. These were important lessons he took away, and he had a reputation by the time of this Suffolk campaign in the spring of 1863 as Lee's right-hand man, his war horse, second only to Lee in the Confederate high command. So the Suffolk campaign is a little bit of a detour. It's an independent command for Longstreet in southeastern Virginia. His instructions are to forage for food and supplies, but also to dislodge the Yankee occupiers of Suffolk if possible. He lays siege to Suffolk, and it's a failed siege. And so militarily, doesn't go well, shows him struggling some in an independent command. But for me, what was so interesting about it was we see him more and more preoccupied as the war goes on with what he sees as the sort of failings of the Confederacy, the shortcomings, the deficiencies, particularly manpower issues, logistical issues, a lack of command harmony. And then finally, and this is something that many good, strong accounts of Longstreet's military career have missed, and that is the degree to which Confederate generals, the high command, were preoccupied with the resistance of the enslaved. These months of the Suffolk campaign are the months in which the Emancipation Proclamation is going into effect. It is emboldening further resistance and flight from farms and plantations to Union lines by the enslaved. They had been offering that kind of resistance since the very first days of the war, and the Emancipation Proclamation just is a catalyst to further such resistance. And we see Longstreet was preoccupied, as all Confederate commanders were, with this kind of enemy within, that is to say, Black Southerners who were Unionists, who were doing all they could to flee slavery and then to offer their services to the Union Army as spies and scouts and laborers and so on. And this was a blow to the Confederacy, in part because Longstreet and his army relied on the forced labor of enslaved laborers to do all kinds of things like dig ditches and build roads and so on for the Confederate Army, not as soldiers, obviously, but as a forced labor to provide this kind of non-combat support. And so we see this kind of brooding on Longstreet's part about Confederate deficiencies. And to me, that's part of a sort of broad story in which he doesn't lose faith in the Confederate cause as a political project, but he does lose confidence in the Confederate government and in the Confederate high command as the war unfolds. And that's a factor here in that it sort of is something that primes him to accept Grant's peace terms again in the spirit in which Grant intended them, as an invitation to sort of close the book and turn the page and start over on the terms that the North has dictated.
All right, well, we've got to move on to Gettysburg now. No interview about Longstreet would be complete without Gettysburg. And Longstreet's role in Gettysburg has been, oh my gosh, oceans of ink have been spilled on this, and enough books to fill an entire library probably, as well as lectures and other things. And I think about the novel The Killer Angels, which of course is not a history work. It's historical fiction, and the movie that's based on it. And it's so much discussion. So I want to get your take on this, and you do discuss this at some length in your book. So Longstreet, as our listeners probably know, Longstreet has often been blamed for the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg. So could you briefly outline the controversy and then give me your opinion about...
Sure, absolutely. This is, so very interesting. Of course, it's well known that Longstreet had doubts, which he expressed to Lee, about Lee's chosen tactical approach to this second invasion of the North. Longstreet wanted Confederates, particularly in the wake of the successful Fredericksburg battle, the Yankees attacking and sort of impenetrable Confederate position and being decimated. He was hoping that the Confederates would fight, even as they're launching a strategic offensive into the North, that they'd fight on the tactical defensive. And Longstreet believed that he and Lee had essentially agreed that this was the best way to proceed. So when Lee, as he's planning the second and third days of the Battle of Gettysburg, proposes offensive fighting, Longstreet sort of demurs. He tells Lee he would prefer if the Confederates dislodged from the unfavorable low ground staring up at the Yankee position at Gettysburg, and flank the Union Army, move around its left, choose ground that's favorable to the Confederates, invite a northern attack on that favorable Confederate position, maximize the chances for success. And Lee, in both instances, as Longstreet offers this alternate plan ahead of July 2nd and July 3rd, Lee sort of, shakes him off and doesn't heed his advice. And Longstreet is quite disappointed and embittered by this. Now, after the war, and we'll come to the reasons why this criticism emerges, Longstreet's critics, people like Jubal Early and John William Jones and William Pendleton, will argue that Longstreet was not only ambivalent about Lee's plan, but that he was defiant and disobedient, and that he sabotaged Lee's plan by not attacking early enough in the day on July 2nd, for example. And, my own view is that a reading of the records just simply does not support an idea of Longstreet as disobedient or, sort of perpetrating some kind of sabotage. Longstreet, in his own writings on the battle, stresses his ultimate deference to Lee at Gettysburg, that he does what Lee proposes. Longstreet's view was that the delays, for example, on July 2nd, the purpose of them was to increase the chances of Confederate success, awaiting reinforcements, for example. Longstreet is not, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, singled out by the Confederate press or Confederate high command as the person who's to blame. The Confederates are well aware, both the civilians, the Southern press, and the politicians and generals, that there's plenty of blame to go around for the loss of Gettysburg, with Ewell Hill and Stewart and others coming in for part of the blame. So I think that, was Longstreet ambivalent? Yes, especially about the third day. He felt that the plan for the second day was ill-advised, but the plan for Pickett's charge was worse than that, was really, wrong-headed, that he simply didn't have enough men to make an attack on the Federal center successful. But I think that ambivalence does not amount to sabotage or to outright disobedience, and that Longstreet did not single-handedly lose the battle. And I think perhaps the most important thing in terms of, putting a stake in the ground interpretively for when we get to the post-war period is to note that his reputation as Lee's right-hand bandit warhorse was perfectly intact at the end of the battle. He was not the focal point, the scapegoat of the Confederate blame game at that point. And another thing to note is, and I say this in the book, is that we have a tendency to kind of count backward from Appomattox, say Gettysburg turning point. It's just, the Confederates start counting the days to their ultimate defeat at that point. Of course, there was a lot of war left to fight. And as Confederates thought about Gettysburg in the moment, what they were trying to figure out was, A, how to spin the battle as a qualified success rather than as a disaster, a successful raid, for example, and B, they were thinking about how to derive lessons that would permit them to still win the war, which they hoped and expected to do. And the primary lesson they derived was maybe invading the North isn't such a good idea. So this kind of focus on Longstreet as scapegoat and saboteur, this is something that emerges after the war post facto and is not an accurate reflection of the way the sort of assessments of the battle played out in real time.
Yeah, that's a powerful argument when you look at what people were saying at the time, and there was no scapegoating of Longstreet. People overlook that. Oh, I want to say just in passing, too, I am not related to Jubal Early.
Good. I'm glad you put that out there.
Let's get it out there. My dad was an amateur family historian. He even wrote a book on our family lineage, and he was never able to tie us to Jubal Early. Maybe if you go back far enough, perhaps, but that man is an interesting character. There's no doubt about it, but he was a major scoundrel.
Very influential, alas. We'll talk about about the lost cause.
We'll get back to old Jubal in a little bit. But all right, well, that's great stuff. So let's move on toward the end of the war. In the chapter that narrates the last 2 years of the war, you mentioned that signs of Longstreet's political iconoclasm, that's your phrase, political iconoclasm, signs of it begin to show. How did Longstreet's thinking about the war and the Confederacy change in the final years of the war, let's say after Gettysburg toward Appomattox?
Yeah, so I told you that he was beginning to brood some about Confederate shortcomings, and he focuses more and more in the last phases of the war on what he sees as the fatal flaw of hubris or arrogance. He believes the Confederates are making the mistake of underestimating their enemies, and he first starts writing in this way when he's in the Western theater alongside none other than U.S. Grant, who is there too. Longstreet has immense respect for Grant as a military mind and a general. He feels that Grant is going to make the Confederates pay for their shortcomings, their infighting, their rivalries, their logistical mismanagement, and so on, in a way that no other general has done. And so he really starts to become quite critical of his own society. And again, it's not that Longstreet doesn't desperately want for the Confederacy to win the war at this stage in 1864, 1865. He absolutely does. He just feels that there is, one after another sort of failure of leadership and lack of the sort of proper commitment. And again, this kind of sin of hubris of underestimating the Yankees and underestimating Grant in particular. There's a sort of episode as we get close to Appomattox where Longstreet establishes contact with a Union general named Ord, and they talk about whether it might be possible to bring Grant and Lee together for the sort of military men to resolve things after the politicians have so mishandled them as Longstreet sees it. He's no fan of Jefferson Davis's in terms of Davis's leadership by this point. But the way I would, again, summarize all this is to say, yes, Longstreet's a last-ditch Confederate. He's a diehard Confederate, even as Lee and Grant begin exchanging letters that culminate in the April 9 meeting at Appomattox Courthouse. Longstreet is saying to Lee as late as April 7th, don't surrender yet. There still might be some things to be gained, some concessions, some leverage by fighting on. But what all of this kind of brooding does do is prime him again to accept the peace terms in the spirit that Grant offered them, again, as an invitation to start over and to see the results of the war as the arbitration of the political issues that had been at stake, with the Union's victory, military victory, amounting to a political and moral victory as well. That's how Longstreet sees things, and that's a very, very rare sort of outlook among Confederates at Appomattox and in its immediate aftermath.
James here, and now a brief word from our sponsors. All right, I can't resist going off script a little here. If we can cut this if you don't want to do this, but I'm a huge fan of the movie Gettysburg. I told you I also I've read The Killer Angels probably 10 times. I've probably seen the movie 10 times, and I can't resist bouncing a thought off of you as a scholar. Gettysburg, when it came out in 1993, I saw it in the theater twice, this 4-hour movie, and then I've seen it many times since then. And recently I purchased it as a digital download from Amazon Prime, and I got the extended edition, because 4 hours and 15 minutes is just not long enough.
It's not enough, right? Yeah.
I'd have more. But the reason I bring that up is because in the book and in the movie, they kind of portray Longstreet at Gettysburg as kind of cynical. He and a lot of his closer friends and compatriots like George Pickett and Armistead and Kemper, they're portrayed as just kind of, disillusioned. Kemper, but he actually is, at one point of the movie, he's preaching about the cause. We've got to stand up for our rights, and the Yankees cannot dictate to us and all this. He's speaking to the Englishman Fremantle, and Longstreet and the others go, oh my gosh, here we go again, the cause. So by that point, they are portrayed, at least in the book and the movie, as just professionals who are just doing a job. But you just now said that he was a diehard Confederate till the very end. So you think maybe...
Yeah, I think that portrayal of him is somewhat aloof from the cause is just not right, and that it not accurate, in other words. And I think it's not accurate because if you look at, for example, his letters late in the war, like Lee is saying, we have to do everything we possibly can, including all manner of centralization of the Confederate government, seizing private resources, not only seizing enslaved people for use by the Confederate Army, but seizing assets like railroads, seizing gold from civilians so that you can buy goods for the Army. Longstreet was again, for all of the kind of talk of states' rights, he was absolutely committed to the Confederate government as a centralized and centralizing entity, using all the power it could to put its thumb on the scales, particularly to supply the Army. The Army's lack of supplies was something that was constantly on Longstreet's mind. So again, in a way, I haven't seen the movie or read the book Killer Angels in a very, very long time, so I don't want to comment directly on that. But I'll say that I was aware of this image of him as aloof, and it would have been kind of easier for me in terms of explaining his post-war turnabout if he had been, if I'd been able to say, well, this is a guy who was just going through the motions or had doubts and so on. But that's not what in the moment sources suggest. So it just ups the ante for explaining why he, reacts after the war in the way that he does and why he proves receptive to Reconstruction and to the Republican Party's plans for remaking the South.
Well, that is fascinating. I think the author of the novel and I think the makers of the movie, they were trying to make Longstreet a little bit more modern, a little bit more, sensitive, or what's the word? Less of a diehard Confederate than he really was. I think they were trying to make him more heroic to modern sensibilities. So yeah, that's very interesting. So he was not like that. He was a diehard believer in the cause. Wow. Okay, cool. All right. Well, let's go past the end of the war here. Between 1865 and 1870, Longstreet changed from a hero to a villain in the eyes of his fellow Southerners. How did this happen? That's a really quick turnaround. And what was behind Longstreet's supposed treason, in air quotes, to white Southerners?
So Longstreet makes this fascinating pivot in 1867. I have to set the stage a little bit for listeners to understand this. So grand expenses, magnanimous terms. Lincoln is assassinated. Andrew Johnson, his vice president, becomes president. Andrew Johnson was a Jacksonian Democrat and a Southerner who had remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, a very rare thing for a major Southern politician. And Johnson had been somewhat resentful of the way elite slaveholders had controlled Southern politics because he came from a more humble background. Johnson had come to accept emancipation as a way of undermining the Confederacy, and he'd been put on the ticket by Lincoln in Lincoln's reelection bid in 1864 to sort of widen Lincoln's tent, make sure that so-called war Democrats and some white Southern Unionists would vote for Lincoln. But after the war, Johnson sort of showed his true colors, his core conservatism, and he really was excessively lenient to unrepentant, unreconstructed white Southerners, former Confederates, pardoning them by the thousands, including people who had been high-up generals and politicians in the Confederacy, and essentially permitting them to reclaim control over the Southern states. And those unrepentant, unreconstructed white Southerners who regained such control passed a series of laws called Black Codes that tried to essentially revive slavery, even though it was legally a dead letter. It tried to create a system of forced labor that would subordinate newly freed African Americans, and this amidst waves and waves of anti-Black violence perpetrated by white vigilantes like the Klan, which was founded very early in this post-war period in 1866. So we have a certain amount of chaos in the post-war South right after the war, and we see the Republican Congress and people like U.S. Grant. He hadn't been terribly political, but he's watching all this from afar, feeling that the fruits of the war slipping away as these unrepentant, unreconstructed white Southerners come back into power. So Congress decides to take the reins of this Reconstruction process, to invalidate the Johnsonian state governments and to put its own program into place. And the core of that congressional program is the so-called Reconstruction Acts passed in March of 1867. At their heart is the enfranchisement of African American men, formerly enslaved men in the South. The purpose of enfranchising them is to create a new body politic in the South of the loyal, of white Southerners who had supported the Union, of white Northerners who had moved to the South and resettled there, many of them Union veterans, of African Americans in the South, and then of whatever white Southerners who had been Confederates were willing to sign on to this new bold experiment in interracial democracy for the first time in the South. So this is the context for an invitation Longstreet got in March of 1867. He had settled in New Orleans. He was a cotton broker. He was successful there. He was well thought of by former Confederates, still considered a hero of the war by former Confederates. He's invited to share his opinion about what white Southerners should do in response to Congress's passage of its Reconstruction Acts. And he writes a series of 4 letters published in the New Orleans press that say, in effect, we should give this a try. We should support Reconstruction, including Black voting. The Union has won the war. It gets to dictate the terms. And in the interest of peace and prosperity, we should comply. So the reaction by white Southerners to this is the very, very fierce. The vast majority of white Southerners in a place like New Orleans loathe the Republican Party. It's the party of Lincoln, of emancipation, of the Yankees of the North, and so on. They reject Congress's plan, reject black voting, and vow to defy this attempt to remake the South. And they lash out at Longstreet, just as you said, as a traitor. He is a Benedict Arnold in their eyes. He's a Judas in their eyes. He is Lucifer in their eyes. We see their reactions are just so over the top. We see many ex-Confederate editors say things like, it's too bad Longstreet didn't die during the war in the Battle of the Wilderness where he was grievously wounded, and so on. So the million-dollar question at the heart of this book is, why does Longstreet write these letters? And what is his motivation? And the conventional explanation has been, to use a kind of modern metaphor, that Longstreet sort of got out over his skis, that he didn't really express his true intentions very well in these letters, that what he wanted was really a return to the old order, and he was urging Southerners to sort of play ball so that they would have a say in American politics, and that he let himself be portrayed as more radical than he truly was because, according to this conventional or dominant explanation, he was really a pretty inept politician. Probably shouldn't have, according to his recent biographers, shouldn't have drifted into politics because it was just not a thing for which he had any skill. So I find that explanation completely unpersuasive. I think it doesn't accord with the evidence. What's really going on is a convergence of factors that motivate Longstreet to write these letters. One of them is his sense of duty to his family and his kinfolk and to white Southerners, his people, as he puts it at the time. And what he wants is peace. And he looks around the political landscape and he asks himself, who else wants peace, really? Andrew Johnson and these unreconstructed, unrepentant white Southerners who are terrorizing African Americans and trying to restore slavery, they don't really want peace. They're just prolonging the war through the means of politics. Grant wants peace. The Republicans want peace, an end to this war. Longstreet's desire for peace has a very intense personal aspect. His family had suffered terribly during the war. So many families did across the landscape of the Civil War in the North and South. But he had a particular sort of crushing moment, a week in the winter of 1862, in which 3 of his young children had died in the space of a week as victims of scarlet fever. From that point on, he really changed his personality. And I think it, again, in the long run, caused him to brood about whether the war had been worth it and about the brutality of war. And so we see him in these letters saying, in effect, to survive psychologically, we have to bury the past with the dead. Otherwise, we literally can't put one foot in front of the other. That was his view. So the decision has to do, in other words, with saying, who am I going to trust? Andrew Johnson? Andrew Johnson is an erratic drunkard, who seems to be doing all he can to further divide America. Or Grant, a noble hero of the war, a military genius, my great personal friend, as Longstreet sees it. He decides he'd much rather trust Grant than Andrew Johnson. How are we going to have peace? Well, there's only going to be peace if some white Southerners are willing to step forward and say, we accept the burden of leadership. We're not going to leave things to these unreconstructed types, again, who seem to want war by way of politics, further conflict. And then finally, this is critical and something that Longstreet's previous biographers have missed altogether, and that is the setting of New Orleans itself is a factor in his decision-making. It takes a while for Longstreet's views on race and on African-American rights to change, but they do change. He doesn't become a perfect egalitarian, a sort of Frederick Douglass or Thaddeus Stevens type person, but he does embrace and accept black voting, and he will, once he's made that commitment, he will stick with it, uphold it for the rest of his sort of political career. And he's influenced in part by New Orleans, where we have this fascinating Afro-Creole leadership class, mixed race men with Spanish and French roots in the region, many of whom had served as officers in the Union Army in a sort of brief experiment of commissioning Black Union officers in Louisiana. These men Black leaders were visionaries. They were political activists. They leveraged their military experience into their political activism. They wanted New Orleans to be, and Louisiana to be, a showcase of congressional reconstruction, of interracial democracy. And Longstreet really comes to respect many of these men, particularly PBS Pinchback, who was a leader of this cadre of Black politicians. And so New Orleans is an important factor here. And then finally, I know this is a very long answer, but this is really the core of the book. On top of all these factors, a convergence of Longstreet's concerns for his kinfolk and his trust in Grant and distrust of some of Johnson and his followers, the unique political climate of New Orleans, we have a sort of dynamic. The white Southern backlash against his letters is so fierce. He's shocked by it. He just can't believe the lack of respect that is sort of coming his way from the ex-Confederate unreconstructed press with all their "we wish Longstreet had died during the war" sort of barbs. The Republicans, by contrast, the party that controls Congress, the party of Lincoln, the party trying to institute this experiment in interracial democracy in the South, the Republicans are incredibly welcoming. They let him finesse the issue of loyalty. The Republicans say, yes, you were a great general in the Civil War. He's useful to the Republicans. The greater a general he was, the more powerful he is as a symbol of repentance and a changed heart and mind, if you will, in the Confederacy. So that backlash against him from former Confederates and the warm welcome among Republicans just leads him to sort of double down on this commitment. Grant rewards him for his brave stance in favor of Reconstruction by giving him an important patronage post in the New Orleans Custom House. Longstreet launches a political career as a result.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting how the unreconstructed white Southerners started from, well, he didn't really mean that, to he's a traitor and we wish he had died. That's just very telling.
Yeah, they saw him as it's very important to note, I'm glad you followed up in that way, he's not the only white Southerner who had been a Confederate to decide to give this congressional reconstruction a try. There are others. They're usually motivated not by any kind of racial egalitarianism, but instead by a desire for peace, prosperity, economic modernization, and so on. But he is the highest ranking Confederate general to do that. And so he, in the eyes of, again, the unreconstructed types, poses a particularly dangerous threat.
James here. And now a brief word from our sponsors. Well, skipping forward in time a little bit, what was the Lost Cause school of thought? This gets a lot of discussion today, so I'm sure most of my listeners are aware of it. But just in case, maybe you could lay that out. And then who were its initial leaders, and how and why did they begin a feud with Longstreet, and what was his response? Sorry, that's a long question. That's really 4 questions.
Sure. It's a long question, but it's really, really important. So the Lost Cause is this form of political propaganda. We can see it taking shape already in the first moments of peace that is promulgated by people like Jubal Early, who we talked about before, William Nelson Pendleton, John William Jones, and others, mostly Virginia veterans of the war, although there are some non-Virginians in the core group as well. Edward Pollard, a newspaper editor, and others. He's the one who coins the term. And it's essentially an attempt to defend the Old South and the Confederacy and declare them blameless. That portrays slavery as benign, emancipation as a disaster, Reconstruction, congressional Reconstruction as a crime. The Lost Cause ideology held that Confederates were completely blameless, that the victory of the Union was a victory of might over right, of brute force, not of sort of morality, or not a symbol of the superiority of Union society, as someone like Grant, by contrast, would have seen it. The Lost Cause folds into it an attack on Reconstruction, and then a sort of claim that the defeat of Reconstruction, if Reconstruction is eventually congressional Reconstruction, is overturned, federal troops removed from the South reverts again back into the hands unreconstructed Southern Democrats, who institute the Jim Crow regime of racial prescription and disfranchisement and segregation. In the Lost Cause ideology, which sort of develops over the decades, that the defeat of Reconstruction represents a sort of belated victory and vindication for the Confederates. The sort of irony of the Lost Cause as a label for all this kind of propaganda is that the essence of it was that the cause wasn't really lost, that it could be still won and vindicated through the realm of politics. So, what's fascinating is that the purveyors of this lost cause ideology begin to go after Longstreet in 1872, 1873, which not coincidentally is the height of his commitment to radical Reconstruction, to this interracial experiment in New Orleans. So the timing of all this is really, really significant. Congressional Reconstruction meets with a fierce backlash. The Republicans set up a government in Louisiana that includes, again, people who had been Unionists during the war, African-American voters, men like Longstreet who were willing to give the Republicans a chance. That government is under siege from the start by white supremacists and conservative Democrats who want to overthrow Reconstruction. There are a series of violent street battles in New Orleans between the duly elected official government and militia of the state, and a kind of shadow government and shadow militia, white supremacist vigilantes who try to bring that government down. This culminates in a massive street battle of September 14th, 1874, in which Longstreet, just absolutely remarkable, the Civil War. You just couldn't make these stories up if you wanted. Longstreet leads an interracial state militia defending the duly elected Republican government of New Orleans and of Louisiana against white supremacist vigilantes who want to overthrow it by force, at a battle on Canal Street in 1874. And although eventually the federal army appears to restore order, it's sort of the beginning of the end of Reconstruction in New Orleans, and eventually those troops are removed and the experiment of Reconstruction comes to an end. So crucially, this is something I emphasize in my book, the attacks on Longstreet coincide with his maximum visibility as a defender of Black voting, as the general of the interracial state militia, as a representative of this Republican coalition in the South. In other words, the charges that he was to blame for Gettysburg and for the loss of the war are politically motivated charges. And the people who level the charges hint at this and say it openly, repeatedly. So there's, it should not be in doubt that the military relitigation of his record is a politically motivated attempt to blame him. It involves, all kinds of fabrication. One of the things that Early and Pendleton and others do is claim that Lee had issued a sunrise order that for the Union position at Gettysburg to be attacked in the early morning hours of July 2nd. There was no such sunrise order, but they're able to kind of assail Longstreet with this charge of outright disobedience to Lee. So the Longstreet becomes a threat to lost cause orthodoxies, to the body of propaganda that I just described. And the biggest way in which he's a threat is that he comes to believe that African Americans should play some role in the body politic in the South. Again, he's not a perfect egalitarian the way an abolitionist like Thaddeus Stevens was, who really believed fully in legal, social, political, civil equality. Longstreet still hopes and imagines that whites will control Southern politics, but he believes Blacks have a role to play as constituents, as voters, in some limited leadership positions, in sort of deference to peaceable, progressive whites like himself. That is a direct challenge to lost cause orthodoxies, lost cause propaganda, which holds that African Americans should play no role whatsoever in Southern politics. And the lost cause propaganda is used to foment vigilante violence against Black voters, to suppress the Black vote, to drive all Republicans, white and Black, out of Southern politics. That's the purpose, political purpose of lost cause ideology. So Longstreet comes to really be seen as a major threat to that body of thought.
All right, so let's skip forward he did a lot of other things. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He was involved in Georgia politics. He was a U.S. Marshal. But I'm interested in discussing his memoir. In the 1890s, Longstreet published his war memoir, now famous, From Manassas to Appomattox. How was it received at the time, and how would you say that the memoir has stood the test of time? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so Longstreet, in the sort of third phase of his life, we have his upbringing through the Civil Wars, phase one. This turbulent chapters in New Orleans is phase two. In phase three, after this big street battle in 1874, he retreats some from politics. He moves back to Georgia, where he has kinfolk, North Georgia at Gainesville, and he tries to make a sort of new political start, build a new political base. He's still a Republican, still supports Black voting, but he is pivoting towards what we might call reconciliationism. He becomes much more intent on being a voice to advocate sectional reunion between the North and South and to set himself up as a kind of herald of reunion, as the guy who could see early on, before other people could see it, that both sides would have to make concessions if there was going to be reunion and so on. So the memoir has a couple purposes. One is to answer all those critics who have been charging that he disobeyed Lee at Gettysburg and was to blame for the loss of the battle. And the memoir is quite critical of Lee, arguing that it was Lee who was off his game at Gettysburg. Lee's blood was up, as Longstreet put it. Lee allowed himself to be sort of swayed by emotion. Lee underestimated Grant. Longstreet draws some pretty stark contrasts between Grant and Lee in the memoir, in which he holds that Grant was the superior general because Grant had a level head in a way that Lee didn't, according to Longstreet. All of that proved very controversial, as you can imagine. But the other major goal of the memoir was to promote reconciliationism. This was part of a sort of trend in the late 19th century. The most sort of dramatic expression of the trend was reunions between blue and gray veterans, in which they would often literally clasp hands as, kind of gesture of a brotherhood of soldiers restored and so on. And so we see Longstreet more and more drawn to this reconciliationism late in life. He really is more determined than ever in the last phases of his life to say that he can be both, a proud Confederate, proud of his wartime record, and a proud Republican. And he is able to sort of, win some allies who have their own stake in reconciliationism and see him as a useful spokesman for it. He continues to hold patronage posts, as you've said, remains an important Republican operative. But even though the memoir is very, very well received in the North, he continues to have critics among white Southerners who are just not willing to let the public forget the New Orleans chapter, not willing to abandon the view of Longstreet as a radical and as a clear and present threat to lost cause orthodoxy. So he remains a controversial figure. I guess another way to put this, his sort of wrap up, is to say, in the last phase of his life, he wants to claw back some of his lost popularity among white Southerners. And he's willing to do so to a surprising degree. More and more are inclined to just kind of separate his military career from his political career and sort of think of them as being in different boxes. But he continues to have these kind of arch critics, again, mostly Virginians, dedicated to a cult of Lee, to enshrining Lee as a sort of infallible marble man and so on, who just won't let up this, longstanding effort to make Longstreet the scapegoat of Gettysburg.
Yeah, that's what I teach on Longstreet. I always say that he committed several sins in the eyes of the South. He became a Republican. He became a Catholic. He joined the Grant administration. But the greatest sin of all was criticizing Robert E. Lee. How dare he?
That was, absolutely how many, many people saw it. And, criticizing Lee in conjunction with praising Grant. So, yeah, that's...
yeah. Can't do that. Okay. Well, anyway, let me ask you just another question. I'm curious, how do they read today? How have they aged? Because I know obviously there were many, many people that wrote their memoirs from the Civil War time. And I've heard that they range all the way from Grant's memoirs, who are still like incredibly easy to read and very engaging, to others that are like reading the phone book almost. But where would Longstreet's fall?
I would say, Longstreet's book, his memoirs, 690 some pages, are extremely important. And there are some sort of pointed insights into this theme of, for example, the dangers of hubris, the relative merits of Lee and Grant as generals and so on. But overall, I will be honest, it's a pretty dry read. He doesn't engage politics overtly as much as one would like or expect. And literarily, it is solid, but it doesn't rise to the level of literary merit of Grant's memoir, which is considered one of the great memoirs in the English language. So I say, if you're going to read Longstreet's memoir, you have to be prepared to read between the lines some, and to kind of focus on the chapters where he's really offering not just kind of, conventional assessments of battles, but really talking about the personalities of the era and trying to, adjudicate some of these more interesting controversies. But I would not describe it as a thrilling read.
Yeah. Don't read it before bed.
Yeah.
All right. Well, bringing this in for landing, what would you say is James Longstreet's long-term legacy, and what lessons can modern-day readers and people who are interested in history, what lessons can we take away from his life and career?
Well, there's a few things to mention. First of all, he has, and very rightly and correctly, come up a lot recently as we've been talking about Confederate memorialization as the exception that proves the rule. That is to say, there were no statues of Longstreet in the post-war South because he wasn't useful as a symbol of the lost cause of white supremacy, of the defense of slavery, and so on, because his Republican stance had cast his fealty to all those things into doubt. And so, the fact that Longstreet was not honored with statues just underscores that the purpose of those statues was to represent all of the various tenets of that lost cause ideology that I described. And Longstreet had come to be a critic of and challenger to all of those ideas. Another way in which he is sort of relevant is the story in some ways points to the importance of accountability. I described that Battle of 1874 attempted coup, white supremacist coup of the Louisiana government. No one was ever held to account for that. None of the perpetrators of the coup ever were held to account. And the state did eventually fall back into the hands of unreconstructed Democrats who imposed this long period of one-party rule and of Jim Crow segregation on the region. And so there are definite sort of modern echoes and important context for modern events there. He shows us that white Southerners were the very important part, and in some ways the dominant part of that Reconstruction coalition, Congressional Reconstruction coalition after the war that governed these reconstructing Southern states. But white Southerners were also the weak link in the coalition in the sense that they were susceptible to the social pressures and political pressures and appeals. And Longstreet was of the Southern Democrats, and he was less susceptible than many others. But nonetheless, as I said, in the last phase of his life, he does want to claw back some of his lost popularity. The ostracism, the pressure had an effect on him, and he does retreat somewhat from the position he had taken in New Orleans. And then, finally, for me, this is really a story about the complexity of the South and of Southern identity. As a shorthand, we talk about the North versus the South in the Civil War. But of course, it's the Union versus the Confederacy. African Americans in the South are Unionists, loyal to the Union. There's a small beleaguered group of white Southerners, like The Spy wrote a biography of Elizabeth Van Lew, who are, true to the Union. The Civil War, as the great historian William Freeling has put it, was really a war of the South against the South on some level. And the same is true of Reconstruction, and Longstreet's story illustrates that. So understanding that the South was not monolithic, that there's a lot of political contestation, within it, is to me another major lesson and takeaway of his life.
All right. Well, thank you so much. The name of the book, once again, is Longstreet, the Confederate General Who Defied the South. And you can find it at Amazon or any good bookstore. It's coming out November 21st, 23. So by the time this episode has been released, it should be out. So folks, you definitely want to get this book. It's an engaging read. It's a fascinating story. And I just want to thank you, Liz, Dr. Varon, for coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate the invitation.
All right, everyone, thank you for listening to Key Battles of American History once again, and we'll see you next time with another episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Key Battles of American History is a proud member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, which includes several other podcasts, including History Unplugged by Scott Rank, History of the Papacy, and Organized Crime and Punishment by Steve Guerra, This American President by Richard Lim, Eyewitness History by Josh Cohen, Vlogging Through History by Chris Mowry, and The History of North America and Historical Jesus by Mark Vinette. If you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to check out these great podcasts. If you would like to support this podcast and help it to grow, there are 4 things you can do. First, you could subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on the podcast player of your choice. This helps other people to find the podcast. Ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts are especially helpful. Second, join our Facebook group, American History Fanatics, where we discuss the episodes of this podcast, as well as other topics related to American history. Third, tell as many friends as you can about the show. Consider sharing links to episodes on social media. Fourth, you can join the elite unit called Early's Raiders by going to patreon.com and searching for Key Battles of American History. There are 5 different levels of support to choose from. Each level allows you to have early access to ad-free episodes. Higher levels bring additional benefits, including occasional bonus episodes and even the ability to commission episodes on topics of your choosing. Before I close, I would like to give a shout out to the current members of Early's Raiders. Thanks to General Jacob Herr, Colonels Carl Archer, Lee Beaumont, Terry Davis, Daniel Fisher, Jay Robinson, Josh Simpson, and Jake Wallach. Majors Mark Bearden, Joan Belford, Chris C., Ana Concepcion Castro, Eric Chester, Bob McCullough, Melissa Mueller, and Doug Pergram. Captains Jared Anderson, Ryan Apashian, Lee Barcalau, Mike C., Alex Calabrese, Carlos Calderon, Ronald Cohen, Alex Coombs, Christopher Craddock, Reed Darby, Jacob Dyke, Robbie Edwards, Larry Flowers, Kyle Foster, Richard Foster, Brian Goebel, Richard Goldblatt, Arturo Gonzalez III, Rick Hanna, Grant Holmstrom, Stephen James, Mike Leslie, Gary Lenz, Billy Malone, Jose Martinez, Tim Moon, Navy Captain Retired, Nicholas Panagakos, Michael Patton, Ryan Ramones, David Santee, Scott Saunders, Michael Severino, Daniel Schumer, Scott Taylor, S.B. Tang, Jacob Thomason, Jeff Vandermeulen, and Clark Wallace. And Lieutenants Patrick Brennan, Sean Burley, Matthew Christensen, EES, Greg Gongoleski, Scott Hendricks, Who's Your Daddy, Paul Haushen, David Lueza, Craig Martin, Todd Mendenhall, Graham Ramsey, Tracy Stamp, Ryan Starr, Scott Taylor, Larry Elk, and Evan Westerfield. I greatly appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Key Battles of American History. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast catcher. And please be sure and spread the word about the show. If you can spare a few minutes, rate and review the show at Apple Podcasts. This greatly helps us to reach more listeners. And for show notes, maps, and further discussion, visit our website at www.keybattlesof-americanhistory.com. Thank you, and we look forward to joining you again in the next episode of Key Battles of American History.